Everyone, hugs and stitches. It feels like we've been away for so long. I do apologize for that. We had some technical difficulties the last time we tried to do one. I'm glad to be back. I hope everyone can hear me. Look, this is Lettering Essentials. And where I really want to start is that, and you know what, part of this is, I am as close as I can be. Let's see if I can get the, is that better? Okay, my pleasure. Part of this is kind of my traditional class that I give. At the end of, because what I want to really do initially is I want you to understand some of the rules of embroidery. There's a lot of you that are new out there, a lot of you who probably haven't heard this. So I think this is important. And in Lettering Essentials, it definitely is important because it is the rules of the process in some regard, no matter what software we're on. Now, having said that, once we're through that portion of the, oh, just a second, something popping up on my screen. Once we're through that, thank you, Kathy. Once we're through that portion of the lesson tonight, I want to get into some of the software advancements that I'm very, very proud of with our Floriani software. In fact, some of it is the only software in the world that can do what it is that I want to show you. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. Look, there are rules to embroidery. Now, in discussing lettering, in reality, with what you're looking at on the screen right now, we're discussing satin stitch lettering. I'm going to talk some about satin stitch lettering. I'm going to talk some about running stitch lettering also. Now, also, let me make clear at this point, this is for both softwares. I know that there are some of you out there with Embroidery Suite, many of you out there with Total Control. What I'm teaching you and what the software will do essentially the same within both softwares. I'm not going to go, I just don't understand why this keeps popping up. Oops, I should have clicked the other thing. If it pops up again, I'll take care of it. Folks, always, I've had the computer on for 4 hours. Only now does something pop up on the screen. My apologies. The first thing that I want to talk about, and it is a general rule for satin stitching, but in this case, again, related to small lettering, okay, is width, all right? Now look, there is a minimum width in the embroidery process for satin stitches. Now, I'm going to talk about two factors initially. I'm going to talk about digitized width and run width. Now, what I mean by run, certainly when you run it on a garment, okay? And there are factors, we'll get to that later. There are always exceptions to the rules. I'm going to talk about that. After my years of studying this process, I have a very simple belief. The smallest satin stitch that you should ever make in the embroidery process, digitized size, is 1.4 millimeters, all right? Now, every time I digitize a letter, okay, or any satin stitch, I always ensure my minimum width is 1.4 millimeters. Look, this is key. One of the things when you bring in artwork and are sizing artwork and your artwork has lettering, bring in your artwork, bring up the size or zoom into the lettering on it. If you're making a smaller logo, always check the width of that lettering. If you're going to adjust, and in most cases, you're not going to have to adjust that much. But in most cases, if I have to go a little bigger, that's when I do it at that point. It starts for me with my initial artwork. I always bring, I'm going to keep the current, there we go, that should get rid of it now. I always bring in the artwork and I start with measuring. Always measure your artwork. Measure your satin stitch width. Look at your small lettering. Now, let's say you've got a design on there and you have no ability to scale it. Width determines what lettering you're going to use or what style of stitch, excuse me, you're going to use. If something that I measure as far as artwork measures from 0.2 of a millimeter up to 1 millimeter in width, it's telling me use a running stitch. Stitch type has always been determined by width. So if I bring in a piece of artwork, and again, it's 0.2 to 1 millimeter or so, it's telling me it's a running stitch, okay? If I measure a piece of artwork and it's 1 millimeter to 7 millimeters or so, it's telling me I'm a satin stitch, all right? Anything more than 7 millimeters, in my opinion, 7 to 8, depends on the fabric that you're stitching on, is telling you it's a fill stitch. Width determines stitch type, it always has. As far as keyboard lettering, working with stock designs, in this case I have a design on the screen, I just always go in, grab my ruler, I measure the width, I always measure metrically. Now, digitizing 1.4 millimeter yields on the garment a satin stitch that actually measures in width 8/10 to 1 millimeter. That's why I said when you measure a width, and let's say it's 1 millimeter, I said satin stitch. Well, why, if I just said 1.4 millimeters, am I telling you a 1 millimeter is a satin stitch? Because finish size, digitized size. Finish size is my artwork structure. Digitized size is the size that I created. Example, I might digitize it, the finished size, because it's what's on my screen. I'll always go into my push and pull, and I'll add pull compensation of 2/10 of a millimeter on a 1 millimeter satin stitch on both sides. Gives me and yields me 1.4. Width is probably the most important aspect to a lettering essential for small lettering, okay? And again, your range for satin stitching, 1 millimeter to 7 or 8 millimeters, depending upon the fabric. My opinion on knit goods, 7 millimeters is my maximum width with a satin stitch. On twills, on canvases, on heavier fabrics, you can get away with 8. Sometimes you can stretch it a little bit more. Now, let me just finish this part on width by saying that every digitizer is an artist in himself. What you're looking at here is what I call a satin width chart. My first satin stitch is 1.4, my next one is 1.6. I actually range 1.4, 1.6, 1.82, and so on, going up 2/10 of a millimeter in width. When I have a new fabric that I've never stitched on before, I run a simple chart like this with variable widths. Why? Different fabrics and how you treat it. And this is the exception to the rule also. Different fabrics, how you treat it. Are you using a fusible stabilizer? Are you using a tearaway? Are you using a topping? Varies and adjusts, it simply adjusts the amount of pull that takes place. Fusible stabilizers help minimize the pull. Using a topping helps minimize the pull. In fact, when I personally digitize, I prefer satin stitch widths of about 1.6 millimeters. The point is you have a choice. You're an artist, okay? Why do I prefer 1.6? I think it makes a prettier satin stitch. So width to me is everything in the process. You have an amazing amount of control within the software. But width is certainly the first essential to small and essential to lettering in itself. Now, the next aspect is angle, okay? You're going to see this in a lot of digitizing, stock designs, excuse me. You're going to see this in a lot of keyboard lettering. There's two ways to make a turn in the embroidery process. What I simply label the wrong way and the right way. What you're looking at over here is what I consider the wrong way. What a digitizer has done here is they've actually come from a straight element of stitching into another straight, into a curve, back into another straight. This forms what I call a hard angle or a hard corner. What happens here? Lots of times this can cause bird nesting. This can also puncture a hole in your fabric. You see what you have here, and what this creates is you actually have the same amount of stitching from here to here as you have from here all the way over from here. Don't get into the process of hard cornering. Look, lots of people have picked up this habit of hard cornering because it is indeed what you see on a lot of keyboard lettering. It's what you see in a lot of digitized designs. Angles for me are also everything and an essential in lettering, okay? The proper way to corner, in my opinion, is something that I call angle in and angle out. I actually start with a straight, but then I begin to make what I call a passive turn, till before I enter the corner, the angle that I enter the corner is actually the same angle of the corner. Watch what I can do here. I'm going to come in here and I'll just select that. I'll come into shape, and you'll see my angles. You'll see how it's straight, it's angled, comes out angled, back into a straight. Angle in, angle out of the corner, okay? What you have here now is you actually have the same density from here to here as you have from here. all the way over to here. Okay, we'll address this more as we go through the webinar a little later, because I want to show you the kind of control. Right now I want to cover these rules, then we'll show you the control that the software yields you. So angle in, angle out. Stay away from hard corners. This is a total detriment to your fabric, all right? The next rule I want to cover as far as a lettering essential is what I call opening size, okay? Look, we all, when we've seen small A's, small O's, the openings of R's and such close. That's because very seldom has anyone ever shown you or talked to you about the smallest opening size that you can achieve in embroidery. The smallest opening size that you can achieve is 8/10 to 1 millimeter. Now, fabric has an aspect of a little bit of leeway to the smaller size, but the smallest opening size, 8/10 to 1 millimeter. So anytime I'm looking at lettering, looking at a piece of artwork, just grab your ruler. Be in metric, simply measure the opening size. 1.2, 1.3 millimeters. My gosh, I almost fall in that hole. That's a nice big opening. Now, let's say we have a letter A is a very good example. Let's say we have a letter A and we measure that opening size, and that opening is smaller than 8/10 to 1 millimeter. Okay? My simple way when I'm digitizing, and this I'm not addressing keyboard lettering right now, but when I'm digitizing lettering is when I come in to generate this crossbar, and I'll just pick another color here, and I'll pick a satin stitch, I just drop the bar. It's a very simple thing to do. What I'm actually doing is I'm pushing it open. I'm keying in on the opening size, and you push open. And look, I know that we're talking about lettering essentials, and I know that what I'm discussing are smaller lettering, but that's where the challenges lie. Very few times do we have aspects in large lettering. Normally large lettering runs pretty well, with the exception of when we talk more about pull, okay, or excuse me, push. All right, and I'll get to that when I get to keyboard lettering also. All right, so opening size, 8/10 to 1 millimeter. Now, I'm going to jump over to some keyboard lettering, because the next aspect that I want to talk about, or you know what, I'll go ahead and just generate some small keyboard lettering here. And I specifically want to put in certain letters. We're going to put an I next to an A, next to an I. We'll put another A next to a V. Okay, and we'll make these fairly small. We'll make them about 5 millimeters. And apply it. It's up on the screen. Now, the next aspect of small lettering is, and these look like they're going to work, but it's okay, is proper spacing. Anytime that you either generate keyboard lettering or working with any type of stock lettering or such, look at the spacing in between the letters. Now, let me explain. I'm primarily talking about lines that go in the same, like an I next to an I, an A next to a V, okay? And this has to do the same thing with the smallest opening size. The proper spacing in between letters that are going basically in the same direction, two letters that have the vertical side here is both, the spacing in between is very, very important. Why? Because when two letters, two satin stitches come too close together, you'll actually cut and split your fabric, okay? Spacing is very, very, very important when you're doing your lettering. Once again, always grab your ruler, go to the end and simply measure the spacing distance, 1 millimeter. It's perfect, okay? That's perfect. Why? The smallest distance, again, 8/10 to 1 millimeter. It directly relates to the smallest opening size. See, when you get opening sizes smaller than 8/10 to 1 millimeter, just in the case of lettering being narrower than 8/10 to 1 millimeter, you actually cut and shear the fabric. See, satin stitches form cut lines, okay? They form cut lines along the edge. Certainly when your density is too heavy, you'll split the fabric and it'll just pull it apart, okay? Proper spacing is everything. Same thing with an A next to a V. I'm always going to check this spacing. 1, 1.2, I'm fine with that. I have an issue when it gets under that 0.8 to 1 millimeter. Now, an I next to an A, not an issue. The A is falling away. My gosh, that I could touch or almost touch that lettering right there. It would have no bearing on there because it's falling away, okay? Spacing is everything. Now, there are instances too. Let me just come in here and change one of the letters. Let's come to this. I'm just going to put on an L and a T. Okay. Let's view the entire screen. Okay. Now, in this software, you'll see here, because one of the things, and it's an optical illusion, but lettering spaces along the edge of the lettering, all right? If I come in here now, this is a fairly new font, so we have a little bit of an overlap, and push is going to push this over a little bit. But many times, certainly with keyboard lettering, you're going to see that the edge of the L matches right up to the end of the T. And when you run it, the T is going to look way out there in right field. Some lettering, like an L next to a T, needs negative spacing. So if you ever see something like this happen, certainly within my software, and I don't want to get into, well, I'll go ahead and get into it right now. We can go into our editing, into our higher level of editing, and I'll actually pull that T back over. I'm not concerned so much about the spacing here. Certainly I don't want them to touch. I want it to maintain about 0.8 of a millimeter, but I'll drag that T back there. So in certain cases, we even use negative spacing. My gosh, the V could almost touch the L because it's falling away, the A and the V because they slope at the same angles. I'm going to maintain that 0.8 to 1 millimeter, all right? Next thing I want to talk about, and really, primarily those are the rules to the stitch type of a satin stitch. Proper width, proper angles, proper opening size, and proper spacing. Again, widths, angles, opening size, and spacing. Let's talk about a few of the other aspects of it. Underlay, okay? Underlay is a very, very important aspect to a lettering essential, okay? Now, this may sound kind of crazy, but what I've always found is I tend to use a heavier underlay with smaller lettering. I have a very basic approach. I use heavy underlay, lighter top stitch, and I'll show you which one that I use in the software. I'll go ahead and select the lettering. My favorite underlay for small lettering has always been this. I'm going to come into the underlay. I will use a center line. I'm going to turn off the parallel, and I use a zigzag. All right, now let me explain what this is, and I'll generate that. Now, when I do this, though, the zigzag inset, I actually set to 0. Let me explain why, okay? See how that forces the zigzag all the way out to the out? What happens, I actually call this loft and lock. I first saw this done by European digitizers back in the 1970s. Structurally, in fact, the aspect, those of you who've seen my class know that we used to draw our artwork in the embroidery process, all right? We made cartoons. We enlarged it. We drew the stitches in place. European digitizers felt that underlay was so important, they would actually take a red pencil and they would draw the underlay in place. I first saw it run when I was running some European designs, again, back in the 70s. And I saw this center line and a double zigzag that covered it, okay? It actually did two things that over the years and a lot of testing that I discovered. First of all, the stitch length that I use for the running stitch, I use a 3 or so millimeter stitch length. Why? Because in a running stitch, in an underlay, length equals loft, okay? Ours presets to that 3 millimeter stitch length, all right? I love that because length equals loft. Tiny little underlay. Many people, when they're working with especially smaller lettering or when they're doing like edge walk, okay, edge walk I use on larger lettering. Once I get up to maybe 1/2 inch or taller, smaller lettering, I'm going to go to simply my loft and lock, center line with a double zigzag. A 3 millimeter center line underlay is sufficient length. It lofts the stitches on top, so it gives great loft. The double zigzag does what I call locks it in place, okay? Many of you, when you've run, you've probably seen like an underlay pop out. It seems like the underlay just pops out. Certainly under small lettering, you'll see it, especially stitching on knits. Whenever you use this technique of straight with a double zigzag, the straight underlay, and I'll zoom into one right here, okay? The straight underlay in this case is a lofted underlay of 3 millimeters in length. The double zigzag, which goes over that centerline underlay, locks that in place. Okay? The fact is, at that point, the centerline can never pop out of place. You've lofted it and you've locked it. Now, when you do that, all right, when you come in and do that, you can actually come in and you can, in your density, drop it down to a 0.5, sometimes even a 0.6. You can go a lighter top stitch. In fact, when you run this type of an underlay, after the underlay runs, it's going to look like a lettering in itself, okay? It'll look like almost finished lettering. It'll look open, but it'll look somewhat finished. You've lofted it, you've locked it in place, and you cover with a lighter top stitch. Material finds stitching, especially narrow satin stitching, obtrusive to it, okay? The lighter the top stitch, the better reaction, in my opinion, you're going to have. That's why in Floriani software, you're going to see lighter densities, in most cases set within the software, because the power-up densities on most other softwares are set for wider satin stitches, all right? The wider the satin stitch, the heavier the density. In fact, here's my golden rule. The narrower the satin, the lighter the top stitch. The wider the satin, the tighter the top stitch. That's why in every class I give, and I'll tell you all now, I make density charts. I make, like I did with exactly this design right here, okay? What you find, excuse me, with this design right here. I make a satin width chart. The wider I get, the heavier density I get. Making a very simple charts of variable widths will tell you the proper densities, okay? Look, things like Save to Sew are incredible. And we've set densities for your different fabric types. But width also controls that. So let's say you run a design and you've made a 6-7 millimeter width satin stitch. You've run it through Save to Sew. You're running it on batiste, or you're running it on a lighter weight material, firm but lightweight material. You might find you get a little gapping along the edge. Folks, just go in, select that lettering, just add a little more density, okay? And we're talking a little bit more advanced. Look, Save to Sew is an amazing thing, but I can't put in all the variable widths. Certainly when you're working with stock data. You can when you've got digitized data to some extent, but you can't when you're working with stock designs. You got to learn a level of control. My dad always expounded to me when he taught me to digitize that you got to make a little time to take a little time to play. That didn't mean go out and throw the ball. That meant sit down and make satin width charts. That meant sit down and make density charts. That meant sit down and make fill stitch density charts. I did it with every stitch type. I tested stitch lengths on running stitch, okay, and then put satin stitches on top of it, put fill stitches on top of it. I tested all my widths. Every time I run a new material, I want, no matter what control that the software yields me, I want to know what's going on. So I make simple width charts. I make simple density charts. I apply different densities to different widths. And I run them on different materials. I'll stabilize differently on different materials, 3-4 different ways sometimes, certainly 2 or 3 different ways. I test. I give a class as I travel around, or as I've traveled around the world teaching this process, that I call Value Mart to Picasso, okay? I was in the process, or I was in the business of making dollars at embroidery. How I finished a design for a customer, or what a customer perceived as being beautiful to me, was in the eye of the beholder. They didn't want to spend, you see, every time I used like a topping, I charged a little more. If I used a fusible stabilizer, I charged a little more. I know most of you are hobbyists, but if those of you that are in this for a business, follow that thought process. Sample your work 2-3 different ways. Make your chart, sample it with different stabilizers, different toppings. You'll get different effects. I call it Value Mart to Picasso. I wasn't even going to go into that, but I think it's pertinent in saying here. You see, embroidery is an art form. In my opinion, as you get more and more into it, even as a hobby, it's something you study. How do you study embroidery? Just what I'm talking about right here. I know I'm getting a little worked up now, but I'm impassioned by this. The work that I've seen, those of you who've had the software now for some years, the work that I see when you come to my classes, it confounds me. You people have an amazing passion. You have amazing creativity. My opinion has been from day one, it's what drove me into this industry. That with a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of pushing towards this kind of stuff, my gosh, you've already changed our industry. You've changed embroidery worldwide with what you're capable of doing and what you've already done. And some of you are such accomplished digitizers at this point, just by using a software we're so very proud of and we're so very passionate because we've been able to instill a little bit about what I had to do manually here into the software. But in my opinion, it doesn't mean you stop studying. It means that I think you need to just be shown and say, look, just simple little width charts like this can enhance the ability that you have tenfold in many cases. I really do. I really do think that. So we've talked a little bit about density. I'll get off my high horse. I get pumped up, and it's been a while since I got to talk to all of you, so I can't help myself. Look, here's a little trick that I love, especially when I'm working with small lettering. And what I call it is hiding stitches, all right? Look, I have a pet peeve. I'm going to turn this off 3D. I have a pet peeve when I work with small lettering. I'm going to zoom right in here, okay? What I've said here is a trim in between, in this case, this E, I believe it was, into this T, all right? That connection stitch, excuse me. Kathy, you know what? I wasn't able to get on a headset tonight. I'm actually on a phone on my shoulder. I guess it slipped down a little bit, so I'm right there, all right? I hope I didn't lose some of that passion I was talking about. It's the connection stitch in between these letters. Now, I do not have a trim set here. In fact, you know what? I'll go ahead and turn it off. I want no trims, okay? Lots of times when I'm doing small lettering, I don't utilize the trims on the machine. I find that it incurs a lot of downtime and can sometimes be a detriment on the quality of the lettering. But the stitch that's left, if I'm not trimming, I know why you all trim, is because you like it nice and clean in between the letterings. But that trim stitch, if it's not activated on your machine, or if you have a machine that doesn't auto trim, this stitch in between the lettering sticks out like a sore thumb. I hate that piece of thread right there between letters. I hate it. Now, why does it stick out like a sore thumb? Because it's an elongated stitch, okay? We've actually finished this lettering and we've stepped, or finished this letter and we've stepped all the way across into this letter. We simply floated this on top of the fabric. Now, this trick really and works best when you're working again with small lettering. With large lettering, well, I shouldn't say with large lettering, I'll achieve it sometimes, but it has to do with the spacing. The control point for me is the distance between the letters. When I come in and measure lettering, and I have, again, 0.8 to 1 millimeter space in between the lettering, I'll apply this. Now, I can stretch that sometimes to 1.2, 1.4, all right, spacing in between, but my general rule is when I have lettering that's space 0.8 to 1 millimeter is the max. Less than that, I have no issue with that. I'm going to apply the same thing. What I do is this. Number one, in the software, come down to where you see stitch ends and select it. When you click on stitch ends, you get these nice little needle penetration points. That's what stitch end signifies. Needle penetration points. That's every place the needle is dropped. Okay? Sometimes it's hard to find the one at the end of the letter. It's normally very simple to find the one as you've entered the new letter. Your fifth icon down is your stitch editing tool. Select it. Okay? Look for the first stitch in this letter T. As you get close to it, it'll highlight. I select it and I move it around. I want to make sure that's the first stitch. All right? I grab it and I right click and I say insert before that stitch, and I'll click on that. I'm going to put a stitch. Now notice what I'm doing. First of all, I'm going to put it right on the edge of the letter T, but then I'm going to drop 2 to 3 tiny little stitches. Now you can measure it, but when you know that that's 0.8 to 1 millimeter apart, you want to go about 1/3 of the way across. All right? The stitch length, and you'll see them dropped in there. The stitch length that I prefer to use in this process is, again, 2 to 3 tenths of a millimeter. That's a very, very short running stitch. 99% of the time, certainly when you're working on a knit fabric, those stitches drive down into the fabric, it disappears, you will not see it, and you'll never have to trim that stitch out again. It also makes your embroidery one continuous filament of thread. So again, the rules for that, okay? Spacing, 8/10 to 1 millimeter. You can stretch it on certain fabrics. When I do this little trick of connection again with the stitch edit tool, I drop those stitches 2 to 3/10 of a millimeter apart. All right, it's going to finish here. It's going to step, 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 step right into there. Those of you who hate that stitch as much as I do, you're going to love me for that. Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and continue. Look, as I said, for every rule, there is an exception. I'm going to open up a design right here, right now. Look, the thing that I want to talk about, we talked earlier about widths, 1.4 being the minimum width of a satin stitch. There's variables. The greatest variable in it is when you're working with, and excuse me, I opened up the actual wrong design. I want to open up my original. Go ahead and bring that up on the screen. Is when you're working or stitching on fill stitches. I'm just going to zoom in. Here's a corporate logo a friend of mine had done recently, okay? I'm going to zoom into it. First of all, when you measure widths, watch. I'm going to grab the ruler. I'm going to measure this width, and you're going to see I'm right at 1.3, 1.4. But you know what? I'm in 3D. Lots of you work in 3D. I know. But you know what? Turn it off 3D because it adds the illusion of weight to the thread. You're not getting the articulate width. I'm going to go ahead and measure this width of this satin stitch. You'll see I'm about 1.1 millimeters. Look, that's the exception to the rule. I'm on top of a solid fill stitch. When you're on top of a solid fill stitch, you can get away with a little narrower, satin stitch. You can get down to about 1.1, okay? So the exception to the rule of width for me is stitching on fills. The other exception to the rule for a narrower satin stitch than 1.4 millimeters is actually finer yarn. The narrower the satin stitch, the finer the yarn. The smaller the structure, in fact, the finer the yarn. All right? Look, I want to go ahead and move on and talk about working with some stock data. Now, those of you who were attending the webinar know that we lost audio. DJ and I decided to go ahead and film the rest of it. I had closed the designs that I had up there ready to go, so excuse me for taking just a second, but I'm going to have to bring up a couple of designs. I'm going to go back and I'm going to bring up actually the design, just one second, where I was showing you angles. And what I want to talk about initially is working with stock data, all right? When you're working with stock data in the software, one of the greatest things about Floriani software for me is how well it works with designs not digitized in the software. We talked earlier about angle in and angle out, okay? Very little software, if any, can do what I'm about to show you. This is a stock design. It's a DST file. It has nothing to do with the software. When I work with stock data, I always look at the angles. And remember, this is that hard angle that we were talking about. I'm going to select it. I'm going to come to the third icon down and I'm going to click on shape. And you know what you see now? I'm going to go ahead and evaporate the stitches. You see the angle lines, all right? One of the highlights in Floriani software is that it thinks it digitized the design when you bring it in. Now, working with stock data, you don't have as full as a property box. It doesn't know everything that was done, doesn't know the underlay that was used. It can't recognize everything. Eventually, I hope it will. But it does indeed recognize the angle lines. Now look, again, I'm going to bring up the stitches. I've got my straight, my angle, and my straight. All I have to do in the software, and again, this is a DST file, a foreign file from the software. I'm going to grab this angle line and I'm going to pull it down. I'm going to grab this angle line and pull it over, okay? I'll evaporate the stitches. I went from that straight, I went to an angle, I went from that straight, I went to an angle. Look, I have a frame of reference. I have the angle of the corner. Excuse me. I want to emulate that. You don't have to be perfect, all right? But indeed, I just want to get close to that. I'll bring back up the stitches. I change 2 angle lines. I right click and I left click, okay? And I just soften that angle. Now I'm following proper angle in, I'm following proper angle out. It took us a long time to figure this out, folks. Look, this is an absolute highlight within the software. The same thing holds true when you're working with font technology. Let me explain something. When Floriani software was first developed, it was indeed a piece of software that we took over and we redeveloped, all right? Many of the fonts that were in the software, and I'm just going to put a letter L on here, many of the lettering or the font technology or the pre-made fonts that were in the software were pre-done, all right? There were 100 some odd fonts already done. New fonts, you'll see proper angles, all right? But on older font technology, you will indeed see hard angles. Now, let me select this for a second and go into commands because what they've done here, excuse me, not commands. I want to go into the column and I'm going to go ahead and turn off, I'm so sorry. I very seldom come to this area. I want to turn off the short stitches, okay? Short stitches are intended, I'll turn it on. Short stitches were intended to help with hard angles. It throws variable stitches. It's okay with smaller lettering. Bigger lettering, you're going to see almost gaps in your cornering when you do this. It does release the stress. For the most part, though, I'm not that keen on short stitches. So again, I'm going to come into General. I'm going to turn off the short stitches and apply, and indeed you'll see the hard angle. When you see this in our font technology, one of the things about fonts when you select it and you come into shape, you can't edit font technology, but I can select it. All right, grab your select tool, simply select the lettering, right click, okay, and say break up text. When you break up the text, what you're doing is you're turning that font technology into stitch data. Now it's like a DST file, it's a foreign file. Now being selected, I can come into shape, okay. There's my angle lines. I can simply move this angle line up. I can move this angle line over. I can right click and I just soften the angle. Look, it's a fallacy to think that every font and every piece of software has the proper angles in it. Again, fonts take a lot of time to produce for software. We weren't able to go in and reproduce all the fonts with all the proper angles. I would rather tell you, look for it. Okay, look for it when you're working with any of the fonts, especially block type lettering. If you see the hard angle, select it, break up the text, go into shape, and then simply change the angles. You'll soften the corners and it'll always be a total benefit for you. Now, I'll just show you, and I'm just going to go ahead and type my name, Floriani. I'll use the same font technology, the same font. I want to do it all caps right now. And I want to show you just kind of the way that I work with stuff. We'll make this about 6 millimeters in height. We'll apply it. I'll come in, I'll zoom in. The things that I always check with fonts is I'll zoom in a little more, okay? I'm going to come in, I'm going to grab my ruler, I'm going to measure the width. 1.2 millimeters, 1.3 millimeters. I want a little more width on that, but before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and select it all. I'm going to right click and I'm going to break up the text. So I've broken up the text. I can come in now and I can select this. I can come into my reshape feature. I can get my angle, so I can move this angle over a little bit. Sometimes you have to select different segments. Okay, I can come in, I can pull this angle down a little bit just like that, right click, and I've just softened that angle coming out of there. Okay, I'll do this on the different letters. I made the lettering a little too small. I do this on the different lettering, so I change my angles. Also with letters that go in the same direction, and of course I have the N near the I. I'm going to come in here, I'm going to grab it, I'm simply going to measure my spacing distance, 1 millimeter, that's fine. Normally I'm going to do this before I break up the text. I always check width, I always check spacing. I'm going to select it. I'm going to hit Control A. Again, if we measure the width on this, we'll see that we are 1.2 millimeters. I can go into my pull compensation. I can say absolutely, just give me 0.1 millimeter on both sides. Click apply. Now I'm at my 1.4 minimum width. That's right where I want to go. B, going to come in and check my opening size here, 1.2 millimeters. That lettering is now going to work. I simply adjusted a few angles, added a little width, and I check the spacing in between the letters. I would also, with this small lettering, come in here, and I'll come right into this L next to this O. I would generate my needle penetration points, come into stitch edit, find the stitch that first moved into it, right click, insert before it, come down here and place a stitch on the edge of the O, drop 2 to 3 tiny little stitches in between, and I just hid those stitches. That's what I do with font technology. I apply the same thing to true type fonts. Whenever I generate true type fonts, I check width, I check spacing, I look at the angles, okay? You can go in and you have total control of your true type font. The other feature, and this is for those of you, and I'm going to talk specifically about small lettering, but those of you with total control, you do have one other thing for minute lettering that I'm very, very proud of. Generate your lettering. Let me turn off the needle penetration points. We develop what we call an aerial center run. This will allow you to run lettering as small as about 4 millimeters in height, 3 to 4 millimeters in height, depending upon the fabrics, with perfect clarity or near perfect clarity. So I can come in here and again I can just type my name, Floriani. Okay, I can apply it. There it is. Here's the actual 1-to-1 size. That's minute lettering, excuse me. That's minute lettering. One of the only softwares with keyboard running stitch technology fonts. Again, this is exclusive to Total Control Professional. The aerial center run is a highlight for me in the software. Look, that's what I didn't get to finish on the initial webinar. I thank you all for attending. Our apologies for what took place. DJ and I sat here another hour after we were done. We decided to go ahead and record the final bit of the webinar and go ahead and get it online for you. Hopefully it's up the day after the webinar. We're going to do our best to do that. Again, our apologies. We love you. Thank you, staff, for doing everything you did to try to get us back up. Hugs and stitches to you all. See you next time. Bye-bye.